Hey, last time we talked about using JavaScript to do two things that are key, both in the world of JavaScript and specifically for your next assignment. And that is using JavaScript to interact with HTML forms and using JavaScript to add HTML elements to the page. All right. And I'd like to take a minute to review what we did last time and then go on to another example. What we did last time was this example where we allowed the user to choose what type of employee the person was, whether they're a manager, associate, or trainee. Put in the number of hours they worked, and it shows the gross pay based on rules. I forget the exact rules. We can see them in the code in a minute. It displays a check if the data is valid. If the data is invalid, it displays an X. I'm going to go in. I did not save from last time. I'm going to go in and I'm going to make that image smaller so it doesn't take up the whole screen. And I'm simply going to do that by putting in a style that says image with 5%. There we get a nice little image indicating that it's incorrect. And we also add the word invalid. And if they get it correct, it shows a green check and says valid. I'm going to point out the key things about this going forward. First of all, the scheme by which we validate things. My process form logic has a couple of steps. It first validates the form. Form will return, the validate function will either return a true or false. If it returns a true, we continue on and process the results. And we display the image for valid. If it's not valid, we display the image for invalid. This is broken down into functions, and the aim with functions, as I mentioned last time, is to make the code easier to read. That's one of your goals anytime you're programming. It's not just to get code that works, make it that is easy to read and also easy to maintain. Here I display an image in two different places. So what do? I write a function that does that. Now the validate form function grabs values from the form, and given that those two have IDs, or that field has ID, it's pretty easy to get value by ID. So that's two ways that you can access forms, is that if each one has a particular ID, each element has a particular ID, you can do get element by ID and pull the value in. I won't go over the validate form in more detail because we went over that last time. But I do want to look over this because this is key, obviously, for your assignment. Your assignment is meant to display images a certain number of times. So you will likely have code like this to call a display image function, but have it being in a loop. Okay? I have a loop in there somewhere. All right. Maybe you have a function that displays the image, that passes it, the name of the image, the alt text, and how many times you iterate through the loop. That'd be one way to do it. Anyhow, we do this in the preferred way. We actually create a image tag in a variable. So that actually creates an image tag with no properties in memory. It doesn't display on the screen yet because we haven't put it anywhere on the page. So it's just sort of, if you will, floating in space or floating in memory. This is how we can set the attributes of it. And in this case, we need to clear out all the stuff that's in there before we put the new image in there. And this is a code that does that. We loop through, and each time through, we grab the top child node in the list that is in here, and we delete it. That would work if there were more than one picture in here. And then we go and append on that location, which is down here, result. We append the new image that we want to create. So if you want to see how to put an image on a page, review this function. If you want to review how to pull data from a form and do calculation, review the validate function and review the calculate results function. Now, obviously, you don't need all the steps that I do in this case because I'm doing a different job than you are asked to do. But make sure you understand all pieces of it, then you'll be able to adapt it to the problem that you're trying to solve in this case. All right, let's talk about your homework before we look at the second example. Let's sketch up something. You're going to need the following. You're going to need a form that has quantity. And how are you going to do quantity? You could make a text box for quantity. Could make a drop down for quantity. Put the elements 1, 2 through 10 in. Could you do radio buttons? Yeah, but that probably doesn't make sense from a user interface viewpoint. You're going to need something to select the coin that you're going to calculate. That will most likely be either a drop down with pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, or it'll be a series of radio buttons. Either one of them would be appropriate for that. You're also going to have a button. Now, this will not be a submit button. The submit button, if you remember, is for sending the form data to a server to be processed. You are not doing this on a server. You're doing this via your client-side JavaScript. So therefore, it's not going to be a regular old submit button. It's going to be a plain old button or input type equals button, one of the two. But it's going to have an on-click event that's going to call some JavaScript function. Now, depending on how you code your form, it will either need validation or it won't. Let me explain to you what I mean. If you code your form to have a text box for quantity, then it's going to need validation. Why? Because the text box could be blank. And therefore, you don't want the calculation to proceed with nothing in the quantity. If it's a drop down or a radio button, you may or may not need validation. It depends on whether you have a default value set in your drop down. How do you make something the default value? You put it top on the list, and that will be a default value. Or in the case of radio buttons, there's an attribute to control whether a specific radio button is checked or not. If you don't know what it is, Google it. Look up the HTML code for a radio button, and it will show you all the properties that it has. And one of those properties is to default one of the radio buttons to be checked. So you may or may not need to validate. If you validate, you're going to do something similar to what I did. You're going to validate the text and the number of coins and the type of coins. You're going to display an error message if it's wrong. Do not use alert boxes. Alerts are boxes that pop up. That's bad because typically the path of least resistance means that you're going to code those alerts to pop up one alert per error. And you do not want to do that because if the user has 2 errors, you don't want to pop up 2 alert boxes. Instead, put the errors on screen. Now, how are the errors going to stand out? Do you have to use the X and check like I do? No. However, through CSS styling, you could make the error message be red and in italics, so it stands out on the page and the user can see it. Why do I say red and italics? Well, that's an accessibility issue. Remember, people are colorblind. If you only made the text red, then people that are colorblind won't be able to distinguish it from the regular text. If, however, you also make it italics, then even someone that's colorblind will be able to see. And in either case, a screen reader for people that are totally blind will read the text to them. So if there's a mistake, put the error message right next to the form control. Should it be a text box? Probably not. You don't want the user to enter data in there. It should probably just be a span where you can pop in the error message. Set the style of this to maybe be something with a class of error to make it stand out on the page. Then you can choose later on to change the way you display your error messages. Instead of italics, you could make it bold and bigger or whatever. Okay, so that's all we have to do as far as validation goes. As far as the actual calculation goes, you're going to pull the value from here. You're going to pull the value from here. Depending on how you've coded your dropdown, you might need a series of if statements to translate the choice in that dropdown or radio button to the numerical value of the coin. So if user choice equals penny, set the value of the coin to 0.01, and so on down the list. You multiply those two together, the quantity you pulled from here and the stuff you pull from here, and get a result. That result you should put on the page. Now, if I were coding this assignment, what I would do is I would get that part working before I worried about displaying the coins. Why do I say that? Well, in my mind, I would expect if I were a student, I would find that part the easier part of the coding. All right. I would expect that to seem easier to me. All right. You don't want to write your entire program to do everything. Test it. It probably won't work the first time. And then go back and debug the whole thing all at once. Do your program in little pieces. All right. That way, you can ensure that one piece works before you go on to the next piece. Once something works, you can be fairly confident that it's going to continue to work. Now, it's not 100% assurance. You could do something in your code that breaks functionality that already worked. That's a possibility. But it's your best bet is to do that, is to code one piece at a time, get it to work, and so on. Now, the last step of this is to display the coins. So you're again going to need some kind of if statement to distinguish what kind of coin it is and what image to use. I've given you 4 images to use, and you can use those images. So you'll have some kind of code that says if user choice equals penny, then the image I want to display is penny.png or penny.jpg or whatever I call the file name. And do that down the line. Now what? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to clear out the coin display. How do you clear it out? We've seen the code right here. Somewhere. Right here. That will loop through and find all the stuff that was put there previously and delete it. So you start with a clean slate. You're then going to want to add an image. How do you have the image? Well, you had that variable that you set the image based on the value of the dropdown. How do I add that to this section? The code is right here. You probably don't need this message node business. That's something I did just to show that it was valid 2 different ways or invalid 2 different ways. What's the difference between your code and my code? My code only displays that checker X one time. If I want to display it multiple times, I would have to put this in some kind of loop, probably a for loop. How do for loops work? We have for, let I equals 0, I less than 5, I plus plus. I equal to 0 is the initialization process. Usually you initialize your loop counter, which we'll call I our loop counter. Usually you set it to 0. How many times are we going to do this? We're going to do this as long as I is less than 5. That's what the second part of it says. third part is each time through the loop, what do we do with I? Now you better increment I, otherwise it's going to sit in that loop forever. So we start I off at 0. Do as long as I is less than 5 and increment I. So we can try this code. That's what this code produces. It creates, and this uses iter.html. All right. You absolutely do not have to put the let in if you don't want to. Works the same. You can also use var. Subtle differences between these, not important at this point. If I make this 15, the loop is going to go from 0 through 14. What if I wanted to display 1 through 15 instead of 0 through 14? I initialize this to 1, and I make this less than or equal to 15. I get 1 through 15. So you'll need a for loop to do that part of it. Where do you get the number here? It's not going to be hard coded. It's going to be on a variable. So you're going to have something like number of coins. You're going to pull that from the form. Document.getElementById, the ID of the text box, dot value. That'll give you the value of the text box. I don't have a form here. I could make one. Let's do that. Usually, for reasons I won't go into now, it's best to have a name and an ID on a form field. And click equals process form. I think I spelled button wrong. I'll put this code in a function. No arguments. Now, just like with your HTML or CSS code, it's best to indent in a way that makes sense. So at a glance, you can tell that this function contains this stuff. Well, this should work. I wouldn't use a break tag here, but I'd probably make an unordered list. You can see code to do that in one of the other examples. I would also use the create HTML element and insert it in there as opposed to doing the inner HTML. But this works as well. So I can run this. I can put in 13. And nothing happens. Number of coins equals the document get element by the counter value because there's some block that keeps me from doing that. Let me make my own little HTML file so I can get a better error message. Hey, am I getting an error? Line 17, text is not defined. Okay, let's look at that. This needs to be in the function. One downside of this, it doesn't give you your JavaScript errors. And there we go. All right. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask. I will on occasion see someone turn in an assignment that says, you know, I couldn't get this part of it to work, or I'm totally confused about what to do, or whatever. I should not be seeing those in the Dropbox. All right. I know some students want to turn something in by the deadline. Maybe that's how other classes work for you. All right. Maybe it's better in other classes to get something turned in on time rather than nothing. My class is different. In my class, I want you to turn in something that's right. Therefore, if you need to take a little bit extra time to get it right, that's okay. But turn in to the Dropbox code that is correct, not just any code. I'm sure you can turn something in by the deadline, but that's not the point. The point is try to get something turned in that's correct. So therefore, don't post code that doesn't work into the Dropbox and leave me a message saying I couldn't get this to work. Instead, follow the procedure that is listed in the syllabus. Email me in Canvas. Zip up all your files and attach to the message. Give a complete and specific description of your error, including screen captures, if they help. Do not upload the assignment, and you'll get better, more timely assistance. The other thing I would say is if you're getting a JavaScript error, look at the console before you do anything. Under Development Tools in Chrome. Wow, who knows what's going on this page? But look at the Development Console. And that's where you find it on Chrome. you look in other browsers, it will, if you Google for other browsers, it will show you what that is. All right. That's your assignment. Let's look at this other example. This is an example that does a couple of things. It creates HTML and it changes the CSS. So what I can do is I'm going to change this paragraph, and I get to give it a background color or a foreground color. Background color is blue, foreground color is white. Change color, it changed the paragraph. It's also writing in an unordered list, an entry that says that I changed the background to blue, the foreground to white. It is smart enough to know not allow you to change the background and foreground color the same. It is not smart enough if you put one in text and one in hex code to change the color. All right, so that's a little bit of a flaw in this little page. Finally, we can clear the history if we want to. So let's look at how this works. And again, study this on your own until you understand it. My intent is my explanations in class, give you a preview, and I hope to explain it to some level. But if you're confused about something, take the time to go over it and ask questions. All right, in this one, another key difference, I forgot about this at first, is the way that it associates the things on the page with the JavaScript. Notice that on this page, these buttons don't have any on-click associated with them. And yet we saw that something happened when you click on them. What we're doing here is sort of the next level, better way to apply JavaScript to an HTML element. And that is by using JavaScript itself. All right. The reason that that's better is we can package these things as components. The HTML only has HTML. We can put the JavaScript in a separate file, and that will only contain JavaScript. And then finally, we can have the CSS. Here's what this does. We declare way up at the beginning an event listener. This waits for something to happen, an event listener. So an event listener means it's code that's going to occur when something happens. In this case, when the window finishes loading, I want to call this function page loaded. So when the browser finally enters in and loads the entire page, then this function will kick off. All right, what does this function do? Well, it finds the button that I call button change. That's the button down here. Also the button clear. And it adds an event listener that says when we click on that button, call the change color function. When we click on that button, call the clear history. The clear history is the same instruction that we saw before. We're going to remove all the children from that area. Change color first validates the form. If the form validates correctly, then we go and we set the style, background color, and color of that thing called changeable. Paragraph with an ID of changeable. To the background color and the foreground color. We then create an LI document. We create a text node that contains these things. We add that text node to our LI. We then add that LI to the area called history list. Let's follow that flow through again. Up to this, I would hope is kind of clear. Because this is the stuff that we've been doing all along, changing the background colors of things. I actually mean up to here. We're changing the background color of things. The only difference is we're getting that value from the form instead of having a hard-coded value. Here's where we're creating the LI. We create text for the LI, which is simply the background color plus the variable BG plus FG. Where it's enclosed in quotes are literals. It will literally add that to the string. Where it's not enclosed in quotes is the value of a variable. So we create a text node that says BG equals, followed by the color that we changed the background to, semicolon, FG equals, followed by the foreground color that we choose. We add to this LI that we created here, this text node. So the first statement creates an LI tag floating in space, right? And it's called create LI. We then create a text node. So we create some text that has BG equals blue, let's say, foreground color equals white. And this text node is floating in space, and this is floating in space. By floating in space, I mean it's in memory. It's not actually on the page yet. We then add the text node to the LI node. So we pop this text right here. So the LI mode now has LI in create variable has an LI tag with the foreground color and the background color. Now that it's prepared, finally we add that to the history list, which is this empty UL. It's initialized as an empty UL. We create things in it every time we press the change color button. Functionally, this doesn't do much different than we did with the other one. It reads form data, it creates HTML tags, it clears out an area, it associates a JavaScript function with a button, and so on. This is the best practices for this. This is sort of the best way to do it, the way that we attach those functions to the buttons, the way that we create HTML, and so on. So this is sort of the best way to code this. Now, if you've already finished and turned in the lab 3, take a look and compare what you did to this sort of style of coding. You don't have to change it, but think about, or you can, you're welcome if you want to, go in and change it to be like this, to not have an on-click event on the button, to create the HTML tags in memory and then append them to where you want them to appear on the page. All right, that's all I had for today. Next week, I'm not entirely sure what we're doing. We're going to start something else, though, that's going to be exciting, I promise you. All right, if there are no questions, we will see you in lab.